Tragedy in the commons is the collective action problem where individuals act rationally on their own behalf to produce a group outcome that is irrational. They have access to a common pool resource, meaning it's both non-excludable, it's difficult to limit one's access to it, but it's also rivalrous, meaning once you take one product out, that product cannot be consumed by another. It's in the group's best interest to limit their access to the resource so that it will be able to replenish itself. But what one individual doesn't take, another individual will take and make a profit out of. This leads to collapse of the resource.
An example of this is overfishing. Overfishing occurs when fishermen take too many fish from the ocean before they can replenish their population. An example of this would be the collapse of the cod fishery in the Grand Banks.
So this is how the collapse of the Grand Banks actually happened. At the peak of the industry, in about 1967, there was no top mark for the size of the catch that would be allowed. There was only a bottom, which was about the age of sexual maturity per fish. So what would happen is these top fish, these largest males and females, which would produce the largest eggs and the largest fish, actually became the most prized. So then these fish started being fished out. What happened next, about 10 years later, were these, the middle fish. Then these fish became the most prized for their meat, and they were the largest in the stock. So then these now became the most fished. Next day was about 1990. At that point, the smaller fish, which are right above the age of sexual maturity, became the ones that were actually the largest remaining in the stock. So then these became fished out. Over the time span from 1967 to 1977, reminder that 1967 was the height of the industry, at about 810,000 metric tons of cod per year. In 10 years, they lost 82% of that industry to about 150,000 tons of cod per year. And what that means is 82% of the stock was lost in 10 years, or about 8% per year. 1990, they lost even more stock, and it was recommended that the fish only be allowed to be caught to an extent of about 125,000 metric tons. This, however, was protested by the fishermen who wanted to make as much money possible. What happened was the stock limit was raised from 125,000 metric tons to 235 metric tons, which basically completely depleted the industry. So after these fish were left, all we had left were these small, sexually immature fish that were a part of the stock. In 2003, was the last time the cod industry was actually fished, and there's been a complete collapse of the industry. There are actually no cod left in the Grand Banks. The last time anyone actually seen a cod was about 2003, and in that instant there was actually only a single cod. So what happened in the Grand Banks was a complete collapse of the industry due to the overfishing and abuse of a common pool resource.
So one system of regulating overfishing is a command and control policy, where a catch limit is set, and once that limit is met, no more fish can be caught. This has led to a race for the fish, however, which in some fisheries means that the limit has been met in as little as 3 days, using both better technology and faster methods to catch the fish. Setting catch limits is the most commonly used system of regulation, because it is both it means that uniform standards are met across the fishery, and it's easy to implement. However, this doesn't necessarily guarantee the replenishment of the stocks, since it's expensive and difficult to enforce and regulate.
Counter policy is actually taxes. A tax would be a per unit charge for the fish over a certain point. And what this does do is it generates revenue that can be reused and introduced into research of the fish populations. However, it's a very difficult political sell, as no politician wants to be the one who would endorse taxes on an industry.
Another policy solution would be a cap and trade policy. This implements a cap, or a maximum, on how many fish can be taken from a population. The government then allocates permits to each of the interested parties, either by distributing them equally or by auctioning them off. These permits can then be traded among the parties to reach an efficient allocation. While this is a cost-effective solution, it is not very easy to implement. Fishermen don't like to be told how many fish that they can take, because this is their livelihood and they depend on it. But a cap and trade policy has been proven to be the most effective way to reduce overfishing and replenish fish stocks.
So as we see in this TED Talk, overfishing and, in a broader sense, tragedy of the commons are major problems facing us today. However, with better regulation and education, we'll have a brighter future for our economy and our environment.